5,000 soldiers march north into the fog. They carry the eagle, the golden standard of Rome, symbol of the empire's absolute authority. The object every legionary was sworn to protect with his life. They cross the last Roman fort on the map. They keep walking, and then, somewhere beyond that line, in the hills and marshes of what is now Scotland, something happens. We don't know what, we don't know where, we don't know who survived, if anyone did. What we know is this: the Ninth Legion of Rome, one of the most decorated, most battle-tested fighting forces in the ancient world, disappears from every historical record sometime around 117 AD. No final battle report, no discharge papers, no monument, no mass grave. 5,000 professional soldiers, with artillery and engineers, and a command structure that had functioned for over a century, and history closes over them like water over a stone. But here is the detail that will stay with you long after this video ends. In 1959, an archaeologist digging in the Netherlands pulls a small clay tile out of the ground. Stamped into it, faint but unmistakable, are 3 letters: Leg IX, the Ninth Legion. Dated to around 120 AD, years after they were supposed to be gone. That tile means either the Ninth survived Britain and marched somewhere else before its end, or everything historians thought they knew about this disappearance is wrong. We will come back to that tile, but not yet. First, you need to understand what the Ninth actually was. Because this is not a story about an ordinary military unit. The Legio IX Hispana, the Ninth Spanish Legion, was one of the oldest formations in the Roman army. It had fought under Julius Caesar himself in Gaul and Spain in the 1st century BC. It had survived the civil wars that tore the Republic apart. By the time Rome decided to invade Britain in 43 AD under Emperor Claudius, the Ninth was already a veteran formation with over a century of continuous service. These were not conscripts. These were not men who had signed up for a few years and planned to go home. Many of them were 2nd or 3rd generation soldiers, sons of men who had served in the same legion, carrying equipment maintained across decades, marching under an eagle standard that had seen more history than most nations. When the invasion fleet crossed the Channel and landed on the southern coast of Britain, the Ninth was part of the assault force. They pushed inland, fought the British tribes along the rivers and in the forests of what is now the English Midlands, and established the Roman presence that would eventually become the province of Britannia. The Ninth built roads, they garrisoned forts, they set up their permanent base at a place they called Eboracum, the city you now call York, and from there they pushed the frontier of the empire further north than almost any Roman unit had ever gone. And then, 17 years after the invasion, something tested them in a way they had never been tested before. In 60 AD, a woman named Boudicca, queen of the Iceni tribe in what is now East Anglia, led a revolt against Roman rule that nearly ended the entire British project. Her forces destroyed the Roman colony at Caledonian, which is modern Colchester. They burned Londinium, London, to the ground. They massacred an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people. Roman Britain came within a few weeks of complete collapse. The Ninth Legion was the first major Roman force to respond. And it went badly, moving fast without waiting for reinforcements. The Ninth marched toward Boudicca's forces and walked into an ambush. Cassius Dio records that the Ninth suffered catastrophic losses in the initial engagement. The infantry was almost entirely wiped out. The cavalry escaped. The legion's commander, Quintus Petilius Cerealis, survived, but only barely. What remained of the Ninth retreated to its fortified camp and held on until the Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus arrived with the main force and eventually crushed the rebellion. The Ninth was shattered, and it came back. That is what you need to hold on to. The Ninth was shattered, rebuilt, and kept fighting for another 50 years. It was not a unit that broke easily, which is exactly why what happens next is so difficult to explain. Pay attention to this next part, because this is where the official record ends. In the city of York, in a museum that sits near the site of the old Roman fortress, there is a stone inscription catalogued as Rib 665. It records construction work carried out by the 9th Legion sometime around 108 AD. Routine, administrative, the kind of record that legions generated constantly, building projects, dedications, garrison notes. It is completely ordinary. It is also, as far as anyone has been able to determine, the last confirmed evidence that the 9th Legion existed in Britain. After 108 AD, the stone record goes silent. No transfer orders, no discharge lists, no mentions in dispatches, no new construction inscriptions. The 9th simply stops generating paperwork, and in the Roman military machine, that means something has gone very wrong. Within roughly a decade of that inscription, Emperor Hadrian arrives in Britain personally, an unusual move for a reigning emperor, and orders the construction of a stone and turf wall stretching 80 Roman miles across the entire width of the island, from the Solway Firth on the west coast to the River Tyne on the east. Construction begins around 122 AD. It takes over a decade to complete. When it is finished, it is the most heavily fortified border in the entire Roman Empire, more fortified than the Rhine frontier, more fortified than the Danube line, more fortified than the borders facing Parthia. You do not build that wall if everything is fine up north. You build that wall because something happened up north that scared you badly enough to seal the border with stone and garrison it with thousands of soldiers for the next 300 years. Something pushed Rome back. Something made the most powerful empire on earth draw a line and say, "Beyond this point, we do not go," and the 9th Legion disappeared right at the moment that something was happening. Here is what most people miss when they read about Hadrian's Wall. The wall was not built to keep people out. The Roman military did not build defensive walls because they were afraid of the people on the other side. They built this wall because they had tried to pacify what is now Scotland, and they had failed, and they needed a way to manage that failure without it looking like a retreat. Hadrian's Wall was Rome's way of redrawing the map so that the land they couldn't hold was no longer officially theirs. It was not a defense. It was a redefinition of the border. And that distinction matters enormously for understanding what happened to the 9th. Now, the theories. There are 3 serious explanations for the disappearance of the 9th Legion, and they lead to 3 very different conclusions about what Rome was hiding. I am going to take you through each one in order, and I want you to notice how the evidence shifts each time. The first theory is the one that most people find most satisfying, because it is the most dramatic. The 9th Legion was destroyed in battle, annihilated somewhere north of York, in the hills and bogs of Caledonia, by the tribes that Rome called the Caledoni and Maiatai. Ambushed, overwhelmed, cut to pieces in terrain that neutralized every Roman tactical advantage. Here is why this theory has serious support. Cassius Dio, writing in his Historia Romana around 200 AD, describes a major military crisis in Britain during the reign of the Emperor Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 AD. Precisely the window when the 9th disappears. Dio writes that the tribes in the island crossed the wall that separated them from the Roman forts, did a great deal of damage, and cut down a general and his troops. He does not name the general. He does not name the legion. But the timing is exact, and the phrase, "cut down a general and his troops," is the kind of language Roman historians use to describe not a defeat, but an annihilation, a unit so thoroughly destroyed that it ceased to function as a military force. The Caledonian tribes had been watching Roman tactics for 60 years by the time this crisis occurred. They knew the weaknesses. A Roman legion in open terrain was nearly unstoppable. The testudo formation, the coordinated advance, the heavy throwing pilum, followed by the short gladius at close range. All of it worked with devastating efficiency on flat ground. But Scotland is not flat ground. Scotland is hills and marshes and river crossings and dense forest and sudden weather changes that turned metal armor into a liability and turned organized formations into struggling clusters of exhausted men who couldn't see 20 meters in any direction. The Caledonian way of war was precisely calibrated to exploit all of this. Fast raids, withdrawal before Roman discipline could be brought to bear. Harassment of supply lines, attacks at dawn and dusk when Roman sentries were most fatigued. If the Ninth marched north in force, without sufficient intelligence about enemy positions in unfamiliar terrain against an enemy that had spent decades studying how to break Roman formations, a catastrophic defeat is not just possible. It is almost predictable, but it gets stranger because if the Ninth was destroyed in a major battle, Rome would normally have recorded it. Not in detail that admitted weakness, perhaps, but some acknowledgement. The Rhine disaster of 9 AD, when 3 Roman legions under Publius Quinctilius Varus were destroyed by Germanic tribes in the Teutoburg forest, was recorded extensively. It was the greatest military disaster in Roman history up to that point, and it shook the empire to its core. Augustus reportedly walked the halls of his palace for months afterward crying, "Varus, give me back my legions." The disaster was recorded because it was too big to hide, too consequential to pretend had not happened. The disappearance of the Ninth generated no comparable response in the surviving record. No emperor cries out. No historian describes the catastrophe with the weight you would expect from the destruction of an entire legion. Either the sources that described it were lost, or Rome managed the story very carefully, or, and this is where the second theory enters, the Ninth was not actually destroyed in Britain at all. Hold that thought. In 1959, a Dutch archaeologist named Hollerda, working at a site in Nijmegen, Novio Magis Batavorum, to the Romans, a major military base in what is now the Netherlands, discovers a tile stamped with the mark of the Ninth Legion. This is not unusual on its own. Tiles were transported across the empire, and a stamp from the Ninth in the Netherlands could simply reflect earlier activity. But when the tile is dated carefully, using both the stratigraphy of the site and the style of the stamp itself, the conclusion is uncomfortable. It appears to date from around 120 AD, possibly later. If that dating is correct, the Ninth Legion was in the Netherlands years after it was supposed to have vanished in Britain. And Nijmegen was not a minor outpost. It was one of the most strategically important military bases on the Rhine frontier, the base from which Rome managed its relationship with the Germanic tribes across the river. A legion stationed at Nijmegen was a legion being held in reserve for exactly the kind of crisis that was developing on Rome's eastern frontier. Because the eastern frontier in the early 2nd century was on fire. The Emperor Trajan, who ruled just before Hadrian, had fought 2 massive wars against Dacia, modern Romania, and had pushed Roman territory further east than ever before. But those conquests created new borders that needed defending, new enemies that needed managing, and new supply lines stretched dangerously thin. In Judea, a catastrophic revolt was building, the Bar Kokhba revolt, which would eventually require Rome to deploy enormous military resources to suppress. In Parthia, the great Persian empire that Rome had never fully defeated, pressure on the eastern border was intensifying. If the Ninth had been transferred from Britain to reinforce the eastern frontier, and if it had then been destroyed in one of these eastern conflicts, it would explain both the tile in Nijmegen and the silence in Britain. The Ninth didn't die in Scotland. It died somewhere east of the Mediterranean, in a war that already had too many casualties to count carefully. There is actually partial supporting evidence for this. Several Roman sources mention a legion being destroyed during the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 Sudid 136 AD. Though the sources are fragmentary and the legion is not always clearly named. The historian Sextus Julius Frontinus, writing earlier, implies that significant military reshuffling occurred across the empire's frontiers during exactly this period. And crucially, no inscription or record from Britain after 108 AD mentions the ninth, but legions that transferred out of Britain typically generated transfer documentation. The absence of any transfer record for the ninth is itself suspicious. Either the transfer was never formally recorded, which would be unusual, or the records were deliberately destroyed, which is far more significant. Here is the part nobody tells you about how Rome managed its military records. The Roman army was, in many ways, the most bureaucratically sophisticated institution of the ancient world. It generated paperwork constantly, discharge certificates, pay records, construction logs, religious dedications, supply inventories. Most of this paperwork was written on wooden tablets or papyrus, materials that do not survive 2,000 years in the British climate. What survives are the things carved in stone, and stone inscriptions were public, permanent, intentional. They were statements Rome made about itself to its soldiers, to its subjects, and to history. When a legion performed well, Rome carved it in stone. When a unit brought honor to the empire, the record existed in permanent form. The absence of any stone record for the ninth, after 108 AD, is not just a gap in the data. It is a deliberate silence, because if the ninth had transferred in good standing, there would be a dedicatory inscription somewhere, at the new posting, at the shrine of the legion's patron deity, at the headquarters of whatever provincial governor received them. These things were standard. They happened automatically as part of the unit is administrative life. Their absence means one of two things. Either the records were destroyed, or the ninth left Britain in circumstances that Rome did not want commemorated in stone. Which brings us to the third theory, the one Rome would have found most embarrassing to record. The one that explains the silence most completely: mutiny, fragmentation, collapse from within. Roman legions had done this before. The Rhine legions nearly tore the empire apart when Augustus died in 14 AD, demanding better pay, shorter service terms, and the right to go home. 3 legions on the Danube mutinied simultaneously. The historian Tacitus describes these events in his annals with barely concealed horror: entire units of professional soldiers refusing orders, killing officers, marching on the capital. Rome survived these crises, but only through a combination of concession and brutal suppression. The discipline of a Roman legion was only as strong as the belief that Rome would honor its obligations in return. Now, consider the situation of the Ninth Legion in Britain around 115 to 120 AD. They had been stationed on this cold, wet, hostile island for over 70 years. That is not one generation of soldiers. That is 3. Many of the men in the Ninth had fathers and grandfathers who had served in the same unit, in the same place, fighting the same tribes who would not stay conquered, in weather that made men sick and miserable in ways that soldiers posted to the Mediterranean never had to experience. The pay was the same as a legionary posted to Rome. The glory was considerably less. Britain was an unpopular posting, the ancient equivalent of a hardship assignment, and the Ninth had been on it for longer than any other unit in the army. Add to this a specific tactical humiliation, the Boudiccan disaster of 60 AD, when the 9th S Infantry was nearly annihilated and the unit only survived because the cavalry escaped. That kind of event leaves a mark on a unit, is identity. For decades afterward, the 9th was a legion that had been beaten badly, rebuilt, yes, but carrying that history. And if the Ninth then suffered another catastrophic engagement somewhere north of York against the Caledonian tribes, the combination of factors pushing the unit toward dissolution becomes very significant. What would dissolution actually look like? Not a dramatic mutiny with swords drawn and officers dragged from tents. More likely, a slow fragmentation, casualties reducing the unit below effective strength, supply failures making operations impossible, soldiers drifting away from their posts in ones and twos. Some absorbed into local communities, some marching south to surrender themselves to other units, some simply vanishing into the countryside. The Roman military had a word for this process. It was called decimation of cohesion, and it was the thing commanders feared more than any enemy. A unit that had lost its sense of itself as a unit could not be recovered. It had to be disbanded and replaced. And here is the thing about disbanding a unit in disgrace. Rome did not carve that in stone either. The legion's number would be retired. The eagle would be quietly removed from the records. New units would be raised and posted to fill the gap, with no official explanation of what had happened to the old one. The silence was the punishment, and the punishment was permanent. This is exactly what happened to three other legions in Roman history: the 17th, 18th, and 19th, destroyed in the Teutoburg forest. After 9 AD, those numbers were never reused. No new Legio XIX or 6 was ever raised. The numbers became a kind of curse, a reminder that the empire had failed there. A warning that some defeats were too complete to recover from. The ninth's number, 2, was never reused after its disappearance. That is not coincidence. In Rome, retiring a legion's number was a formal act. It meant the legion was not coming back, and the empire did not want anyone asking why. Now we come back to the tile in Nijmegen, because that small piece of clay, stamped with 3 letters, changes everything depending on what you believe happened next. If the ninth was destroyed in Britain around 117 AD, the tile is an anomaly, perhaps misdated, perhaps moved long after the unit's destruction, perhaps from an earlier period of activity at the site, possible but uncomfortable. If the ninth transferred east and was destroyed in Judea or Parthia around 132–136 AD, the tile fits perfectly. The ninth moved through Nijmegen as part of the eastern reinforcement, left evidence of its presence, and then marched to its final destruction, somewhere the records don't fully capture. If the ninth fragmented gradually, the tile might represent a detachment, a vexillatio, a temporary unit pulled from the main body of the legion for a specific mission that continued to operate under the ninth's name even after the parent unit had effectively ceased to exist. This happened occasionally in the Roman army, and it would mean the ninth didn't disappear all at once, but dissolved in stages, leaving fragments of evidence scattered across the empire like debris from a shipwreck. 3 theories, 3 different endings for 5,000 men, and the honest answer, the one that the evidence actually supports, is that we do not know which one is true. We may never know. The sources that would resolve this question are almost certainly gone, rotted away in some archive that didn't survive the fall of the empire, or burned in one of the many catastrophic fires that destroyed Roman libraries and records across the centuries. What we are left with is a silence, and what we do with that silence says something important about how we understand history. There are 3 things worth carrying from this story. The first is about what absence means. The most important events are sometimes the ones that powerful institutions refuse to record. Rome's silence about the ninth is not an accident or a gap in the archive. It is a choice, a deliberate decision to let 5,000 men disappear from the official record without explanation. That kind of silence protects something, and what it most likely protects is the image of an empire that could not afford to admit how many ways Britain was defeating it. When you read history and you find a silence, ask who made it and why, and what it is protecting. The silence is the story. The second is about the edges of power. Rome, at the height of the 2nd century AD, was extraordinary, the most sophisticated administrative, military, and engineering civilization the Western world had yet produced. And even at that height, it could send 5,000 professional soldiers to an island at the edge of the known world and lose them completely. Not because the soldiers were weak, not because the tactics were wrong, but because the edges of an empire are where the fiction of invincibility goes to die. Every empire in history has had its Britain, the place where the machine stops working, where the territory won't stay, one, where the gap between what power promises and what it can actually deliver becomes impossible to ignore. The 9th Legion walked into Rome's Britain, and it didn't walk out. And the third, the one that matters most, these were not a mystery. They were not a puzzle. They were people. They were 22-year-old men from small towns in Spain and southern Gaul who learned Latin so they could join the greatest army in the world, who carried their equipment for decades across thousands of miles, who built roads through Yorkshire that you can still find traces of today, who worship their gods in small stone shrines that archaeologists dig up in farmers' fields, who wrote letters home that their families kept for years before the papyrus crumbled. Whatever happened to them, ambush in the Scottish fog, death in the Judean desert, slow dissolution in the cold of a British winter, it happened to them personally, to their bodies, to the specific lives they had made in a specific place at the edge of everything they knew. History moved on. They didn't get to somewhere, in the hills north of York, or in a transit camp in the Netherlands, or on a hillside in Judea watching the smoke rise from a city they had been sent to destroy. The last soldiers of the 9th Legion spent their last hours as a unit. They may not have known it was the end. Most people don't. They were probably cold and tired and thinking about food and missing people who were very far away. And then the eagle went down, and the standard that 100 years of soldiers had sworn to protect with their lives passed out of the record of history forever. Rome built a wall and never looked north again.